They thought cutting off their parents before winter would force them into a nursing home, but when 72-year-old Margaret and 74-year-old Robert refused to beg, their 3 children did the unthinkable. They disowned them completely, blocked their numbers, and told the entire family the elderly couple were selfish and losing their minds. But 6 weeks later, a lawyer's letter arrived that would change everything. The mansion their children knew nothing about, the inheritance worth more than anyone could imagine, and the secret buried beneath those forest floors would prove that sometimes the people who abandon you give you exactly the freedom you need to find what you were always meant to protect. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The frost came early to Cedar Falls that year. Margaret Chen stood at the kitchen window of the small ranch house she and Robert had called home for 43 years, watching ice crystals form delicate patterns on the glass. Her hands, weathered from decades of gardening and cooking and caring, wrapped around a coffee mug that had lost its warmth 20 minutes ago. She wasn't looking at the frost, not really. She was replaying the words her daughter Sarah had screamed at her just 3 hours earlier. "You're being selfish! You're being completely unreasonable!" Margaret was 72. Robert was 74. They'd been married for 48 years, raised 3 children in this house, buried both sets of parents, survived cancer twice between them, and built a quiet, simple life based on love, patience, and the kind of partnership that only comes from choosing each other every single day for nearly 5 decades. But according to their children, that wasn't enough anymore. Robert shuffled into the kitchen, his slippers making soft sounds against the linoleum floor they'd installed together in 1997. He was tall still, though age had curved his shoulders forward slightly. His hair was pure white now, but his eyes, those soft brown eyes Margaret had fallen in love with at 23, still held the same gentle warmth. "You didn't sleep," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "Couldn't." He moved beside her and without a word wrapped his arm around her waist. They stood like that for a long time, 2 people who'd learned that sometimes silence said more than any words could. The intervention, as Sarah had called it, had happened the day before. All 3 of their children had shown up unannounced. Sarah, 46, a real estate agent with perfectly highlighted hair and a Mercedes she couldn't really afford. David, 43, a financial advisor who talked about portfolio diversification the way some people talked about religion. And Jennifer, 39, the youngest, a pharmaceutical sales rep who wore designer suits and had somehow convinced herself she was better than the people who raised her. They'd sat Margaret and Robert down in their own living room like children being scolded and laid out their plan. The house needed to be sold. It was too big, too much maintenance, too much for 2 elderly people. The equity, roughly $320,000, would be split. Margaret and Robert would move into an assisted living facility that Sarah had already toured. Jennifer had the brochures. David had run the numbers. They'd already discussed it, decided it, planned it, all without asking their parents what they wanted. "We're thinking of you," Sarah had said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made Margaret's jaw tight. "You're not getting any younger. What if Dad falls? What if you have another health scare? We can't keep worrying about you out here all alone." Robert had been quiet, letting Margaret speak first the way he always did. "We're not selling the house," Margaret had said simply. "This is our home." The room had shifted then. David leaned forward, hands clasped like he was about to close a deal. "Mum, be reasonable. You can't maintain this place. The roof needs work. The furnace is 20 years old. The driveway has cracks. It's not sustainable." "We'll manage," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. "We've managed for 43 years. Jennifer sighed dramatically. "You're not listening. We're trying to help you. We've already put deposits down at Silverwood Estates. It's a beautiful facility. You'd have your own apartment, meals provided, activities, medical staff on site." "We don't want to live in a facility," Margaret said. "We want to live here, in our home, together." That's when Sarah's voice had risen. "You're being selfish. You're being completely unreasonable. We're trying to plan for your future, and you're acting like children." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. 72 years old, and her daughter was calling her a child. "We've made our decision," Robert had said, standing up slowly. His back hurt, but he stood tall anyway. "This is our home, our life, and we're not selling it." David stood too, his face reddening. "Fine, fine. But don't come crying to us when you can't handle it anymore. Don't expect us to drop everything when you fall or get sick or can't pay your bills." "We've never asked you to drop everything," Margaret said quietly. "We raised you to have your own lives." "Yeah, well, maybe you should have raised us to be more important to you than this house," Jennifer snapped, grabbing her purse. They'd left in a storm of slammed doors and spinning tires on gravel. That was yesterday. This morning, Margaret woke to find 17 missed calls and a group text from Sarah that had been sent to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people Margaret hadn't spoken to in years. The message was simple and devastating. "Margaret and Robert are refusing help and showing signs of cognitive decline. We're worried about their safety and decision-making abilities. Please keep them in your thoughts." Cognitive decline. The words burned. Margaret had a master's degree in education. She'd taught elementary school for 34 years. She balanced their checkbook, managed their modest investments, read 3 books a month, and completed the New York Times crossword every Sunday. Robert had been a civil engineer. He'd designed bridges that still stood across 2 states. He volunteered twice a week at the library, teaching adults how to use computers. His mind was as sharp as it had ever been, but their children had decided they were losing it. And they'd told everyone. The phone calls started by 9 in the morning. Concerned relatives asking if they were okay, if they needed help, suggesting gently that maybe Sarah had a point. By noon, Margaret stopped answering. By evening, she'd turned her phone off completely. Robert found her crying in the garden that night, her hands buried in the soil of the flower bed she'd tended for decades. "They hate us," she whispered. "No," Robert said, kneeling beside her despite the pain in his knees. "They're just lost. They don't understand what matters. We gave them everything." "I know. We loved them. I know." Margaret looked up at him, dirt smudged on her cheek, tears cutting clean lines through it. "What do we do?" Robert pulled her close, and they sat there in the garden as the sun set. 2 people who'd weathered so much together, now facing something they never expected: abandonment by their own children. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Sarah blocked their numbers. David sent one cold email stating he would no longer be providing financial advice and suggested they hire a professional. Jennifer changed her address in their contact list, so the birthday card Margaret sent came back, marked Return to Sender. Thanksgiving came and went. The table that usually held 12 now held 2. Margaret cooked a small turkey anyway, because traditions mattered even when they hurt. Robert carved it with hands that shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of grief. They didn't talk about their children. Talking made it real. The bills started piling up in ways they hadn't before, not because Margaret and Robert couldn't pay them, but because the weight of everything made even simple tasks feel impossible. The roof did need work. The furnace did make concerning noises. The driveway cracks were getting worse. But selling meant surrender. Selling meant their children were right. So they stayed. They patched what they could. They turned the heat down to save money and wore extra sweaters. They cancelled their newspaper subscription and stopped going out to the diner on Friday nights. And slowly, quietly, they began to wonder if maybe their children had been right. Maybe they were too old. Maybe they were being stubborn. Maybe cognitive decline looked like this, refusing to see reality. December arrived with snow and silence. That's when the letter came. It was a Tuesday. Margaret brought in the mail, sorting through the usual catalogues and bills. Then she stopped. A thick, cream-coloured envelope, expensive paper, with a return address from DeWitt and Associates, attorneys at law, somewhere called Pinehaven, 6 hours north. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter, typed on letterhead, that looked like it cost more per page than their monthly grocery bill. Dear Mrs. Margaret Chen and Mr. Robert Chen, it began. I am writing to inform you of an inheritance left to you by your late relative, Mr. Augustus Whitmore. Margaret's breath caught. Augustus Whitmore. She'd heard that name exactly twice in her entire life. Once when her mother mentioned him in passing, calling him her strange uncle who'd gone off into the woods and never came back. And once in a genealogy project Sarah had done in high school, a distant great-uncle on Margaret's mother's side who'd disappeared from family records after 1976. She kept reading. Mr. Whitmore passed away in October of this year at the age of 98. As his sole surviving blood relative, you have been named as the primary beneficiary of his estate. This includes a property located at 47 acres on Whitmore Ridge Road, Pinehaven, along with the main residence and all contents therein. The letter went on to detail legal specifics, tax implications, and requested their presence at the law office to finalize the transfer. At the bottom, a handwritten note. The property has been unoccupied since Mr. Whitmore's death. I should mention it is quite remote and has been vacant for the better part of 40 years while Mr. Whitmore lived elsewhere. The locals have opinions about the place. I'd be happy to discuss details in person. Sincerely, Howard DeWitt. Margaret read it 3 times before calling for Robert. He read it twice. They sat at the kitchen table, the letter between them, and stared at each other. 47 acres, Robert said slowly. I didn't even know he existed, Margaret whispered. Not really. And he left everything to you. Margaret's mind spun. The children. Robert's jaw tightened. What about them? They'll want... No. His voice was sharp, sharper than she'd heard in months. No, Margaret. They disowned us. They told the family we're losing our minds. They blocked our numbers. They don't get to want anything. Margaret looked down at the letter. A property. An inheritance. Something that was theirs, legally, completely, with no connection to the children who'd abandoned them. Should we tell them? She asked quietly. Robert was silent for a long time. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. I think, he said slowly, we should go see what this property is first. Then we decide who needs to know what. The next morning, Margaret called the number on the letterhead. Howard DeWitt answered on the second ring. He had a kind voice, older, patient. He confirmed everything in the letter and offered to meet them the following week. I have to warn you, he said. The property is quite isolated. The house itself is substantial. Mr. Whitmore was a unique individual. The locals avoid the place. There are stories. What kind of stories? Margaret asked. Howard paused. The kind people tell when they don't understand someone. Mr. Whitmore kept to himself. The house has been empty for decades, but he maintained it from a distance, paid for upkeep, utilities, everything. Never let anyone inside except the caretaker, and even he wasn't allowed in certain rooms. Margaret's pulse quickened. Why? That, Howard said gently, is something you'll have to discover for yourself. They set the appointment for the following Tuesday. Margaret hung up and looked at Robert. This is insane. Probably, he agreed. We're 72 and 74 years old. Yes, we should be slowing down, not driving 6 hours into the wilderness to look at a mansion we inherited from a man we never met. Robert smiled, the first real smile she'd seen in weeks. Should we? Despite everything, Margaret smiled back. Sarah would have a fit. Yes, she would. They started laughing then, the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion and grief, and the sudden absurd possibility that maybe, just maybe, The universe had a sense of humor after all. Of course, the children found out. Margaret wasn't sure how. Maybe a cousin had talked. Maybe David had contacts at the county recorder's office. Maybe it was just the way small-town gossip worked, invisible and inevitable. 3 days before they were scheduled to drive to Pinehaven, Sarah showed up. She didn't knock. She still had a key from years ago, and she used it, walking into the kitchen where Margaret was making lunch like she owned the place. "We need to talk," Sarah announced. Margaret turned slowly from the stove. "You blocked my number." Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "I heard about the inheritance." "Of course you did." "Mum, this is serious. You can't just accept property without understanding the implications. There are tax consequences, liability issues, maintenance costs. You need legal representation." "We have a lawyer," Margaret said quietly. "Mr. DeWitt." Sarah scoffed. "Some small-town attorney who probably works out of a strip mall? Mum, you need real legal help. David knows people. We can help you navigate this." "We?" Sarah blinked. "What? You said we can help, but you disowned us. You told the entire family we were losing our minds. You blocked our numbers and returned our mail and abandoned us." Sarah's face reddened. "That's not fair. We were trying to help you." "By calling us incompetent? We never said—" "Cognitive decline, Sarah. You texted everyone that we were showing signs of cognitive decline." Sarah looked away. "I was worried." "You were embarrassed that we didn't do what you wanted." The silence stretched between them, years of unspoken resentments finally surfacing. "Look," Sarah said finally, her voice tight. "I came here to help. This inheritance, it's complicated. You need to sell that property and use the money to move somewhere safe, somewhere we can keep an eye on you." Margaret turned off the stove. She dried her hands on a towel, taking her time, thinking about what she wanted to say. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "Your father and I are going to Pinehaven next Tuesday to see the property. Then we'll decide what to do with it. This is our inheritance, our decision. And frankly, Sarah, after everything, you don't get a vote." Sarah's mouth fell open. "Excuse me? You heard me. I'm your daughter, and I'm your mother, but that didn't stop you from trying to force us out of our home, did it?" Sarah grabbed her purse, her face flushed with anger. "Fine, fine. Make a mistake. But when you can't handle it, when you're overwhelmed and drowning in property taxes and repair costs, don't come crying to me." "We won't," Margaret said simply. Sarah stormed out, and this time Margaret didn't cry. This time she just stood in her kitchen, in the house she'd fought to keep, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Powerful. That night, Margaret and Robert packed. They didn't own much in the way of travel gear anymore, but they found their old suitcases in the attic, dusted them off, and filled them with practical clothes, medications, and a sense of adventure they'd thought they'd lost decades ago. "What if it's nothing?" Margaret asked as they lay in bed that night. "What if it's just a shack in the woods?" Robert reached for her hand in the darkness. "Then we'll have taken a drive together. When's the last time we did that?" She squeezed his fingers. 1998, that trip to the coast. 27 years ago. We're not the same people we were then. "No," Robert agreed. "We're better. We've survived more, loved longer. We're exactly who we need to be." Margaret turned toward him, even though she couldn't see his face in the dark. "I'm scared." "Me too. But I'm excited too." "Me too." They left before dawn on Tuesday, the car loaded with their small suitcases and a thermos of coffee Margaret had made at 4 in the morning. The roads were empty, fog clinging to the edges of everything as they drove north, leaving Cedar Falls behind. Robert drove the first 3 hours while Margaret navigated with an old road atlas they'd found in the garage. They didn't talk much, just listened to old country music on the radio and watched the landscape change from suburban sprawl to farmland to thick pine forests that seemed to swallow the highway whole. They stopped for lunch at a small diner in a town that consisted of one stoplight and a gas station. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, brought them coffee and asked where they were headed. Pinehaven, Robert said. The waitress's smile faltered. Passing through? Visiting, Margaret said. We inherited some property there. The waitress set down their coffee carefully. The Whitmore place. Margaret's pulse jumped. You know it? Everyone knows it, the waitress said quietly. Augustus Whitmore was, well, he was something, kept to himself mostly. That house of his up on the ridge. Nobody goes up there. Not anymore. Why not? Robert asked. The waitress glanced around the empty diner like someone might be listening. Stories. Probably nothing true, but you know how people talk. They say he had secrets up there, things he brought back from the war, things he was protecting or hiding or both. She paused. You really inherited it? Margaret nodded. The waitress smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, good luck to you. I hope you find what you're looking for. They ate their sandwiches in thoughtful silence and got back on the road. Pinehaven appeared through the trees like something from a faded postcard. It wasn't quite a town, more a collection of buildings clustered around a main street that couldn't have been more than 3 blocks long. A general store, a post office, a diner smaller than the one they'd stopped at, and at the end of the street, a brick building with a sign that read, DeWitt and Associates, established 1947. Howard DeWitt was exactly what Margaret had pictured. 70-something, wire-rimmed glasses, cardigan sweater, and a handshake that was firm but gentle. His office smelled like old books and coffee, and the walls were lined with legal texts that looked like they predated the internet. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, he said warmly, please sit. I'm so glad you made the journey. They settled into leather chairs that creaked with age. Howard pulled out a thick folder. I'll be direct with you because I suspect you appreciate honesty. Augustus Whitmore was my client for 43 years. I handled all his legal affairs, his estate planning, his property management. He was one of the most fascinating men I've ever known. We never met him, Margaret said. I know. He was aware of you, though. He'd been tracking your family line for decades. When your mother passed 12 years ago, he updated his will specifically to name you as his heir. Robert leaned forward. Why us? Why Margaret? Howard smiled. He said, and I quote, she married for love, raised her children with integrity, and never chased money. That's the kind of person who should decide what happens to what I've protected. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Howard continued. The property is substantial, 47 acres of forested land. The house itself is just over 8,000 square feet, built in 1923, renovated extensively in the 70s. It's been maintained but unoccupied since Mr. Whitmore moved to a care facility in 2021. 8,000 square feet, Robert repeated. Howard nodded. It's a mansion, Mr. Chen. There's no other word for it. And I should tell you, Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions. The property is yours, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. But there are conditions. Margaret's stomach tightened. What kind of conditions? You must visit the property before making any decisions about its future. You must enter it alone, without real estate agents or family members who weren't named in the will. And you must read the letter he left for you, which is in the house. That's it? Robert asked. That's it. After that, you're free to do whatever you wish. Sell it, live in it, demolish it. It's yours. Howard pulled out a set of keys, old brass, heavy, and a hand-drawn map. The house is 15 miles from here, up Whitmore Ridge Road. It's not easy to find. Locals avoid it, so there are no signs. Follow this map. The keys will open the front gate and the main door. Margaret took the keys. They were cold and surprisingly heavy in her palm. One more thing, Howard said gently. There have been rumors about that house for years. People say Augustus was hiding something, protecting something. I can't confirm or deny any of it. What I can tell you is that he trusted you with whatever's there. He believed you'd do the right thing. They left the office in a daze, climbed back into their car, and studied the map. "We don't have to do this today," Robert said. "We could get a hotel room, rest, go tomorrow." Margaret looked at the keys in her hand, then at her husband. "No, let's go now, while we still have light." Whitmore Ridge Road was exactly as difficult to find as Howard had warned. They missed the turn twice, finally spotting the overgrown path that barely qualified as a road. Tree branches scraped the sides of their car as they climbed higher into the hills. The forest grew thicker, darker. The temperature dropped. Margaret shivered despite the heater running. Then the trees opened up. Margaret gasped. Before them stood a mansion that belonged in a Gothic novel. 3 stories of dark stone, tall windows like watchful eyes, a tower on the east wing that pierced the grey sky. It was massive, imposing, and somehow beautiful in its severity. The gate was iron, 12 feet tall, with an elaborate W worked into the design. Robert got out and used the first key. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly for something supposedly abandoned. They drove through and up a circular driveway to the front entrance. Stone steps led to massive oak doors carved with intricate patterns. Margaret and Robert stood before those doors, holding hands, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Ready?" Robert whispered. "No," Margaret said, "but let's do it anyway." He turned the key. The lock clicked. The door swung open on silent hinges. And together, 72 and 74 years old, disowned by their children and abandoned by their family, Margaret and Robert Chen stepped into a house that would change everything they thought they knew about their lives, about family, and about the secrets people keep buried in the dark. The air inside the mansion hit them like a wall, not musty, not stale, but preserved. It smelled of lemon oil and old wood, and something Margaret couldn't quite name. The entryway was massive, easily 20 feet high, with a chandelier hanging from the ceiling that looked like it belonged in a palace. The floor was marble, black and white checkered, without a single crack. Robert closed the door behind them, and the sound echoed through the space. "This can't be real," Margaret whispered. They moved deeper inside, their footsteps creating soft echoes. To the left, a grand staircase curved upward, the banister carved from dark wood so polished it gleamed. To the right, an arched doorway led to what appeared to be a sitting room. Straight ahead, a hallway stretched into shadows. Everything was clean. Not just clean, but maintained. No dust on the surfaces, no cobwebs in the corners. The furniture, all dark wood and deep leather, sat exactly as if someone had just stepped out for an afternoon walk. "Howard said this place had been empty for years," Robert said slowly. "But it looks like someone was here yesterday." Margaret ran her finger along a side table. Nothing, completely clean. She looked up at Robert, her pulse quickening. "Someone's been taking care of it." They explored the sitting room first. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with books organized by subject: history, art, languages, engineering. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, logs stacked neatly beside it, ready to light. Above the mantel hung a portrait. Margaret stopped breathing. The man in the painting was perhaps 60, maybe older. He had sharp features, intense grey eyes that seemed to follow you, and an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just watchful. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plaque read, "Augustus Whitmore, 1921 to 2024. "That's him," Robert said quietly. Margaret stared at those painted eyes. "He looks like he's guarding something." They moved through the house slowly, almost reverently. The dining room had a table that could seat 20. The kitchen was enormous, with modern appliances installed alongside vintage details. Margaret opened the refrigerator and jerked back. It was running. Cold air spilled out. "Robert!" He came over, looked inside. Empty but functioning. He checked the lights. They worked. The water ran clear from the taps. "Utilities are still on," he said. Everything's still on. Upstairs, they found bedroom after bedroom, each one furnished, each one pristine. The master suite took up the entire west wing, a four-poster bed with carved posts, windows overlooking the forest, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and separate shower, and everywhere that same eerie perfection, like the house was waiting. In the master bedroom, Margaret found the first personal item, a photograph in a silver frame on the nightstand. It showed a much younger Augustus, maybe 30, standing beside a woman. They weren't smiling exactly, but there was warmth in how they stood close together. On the back, faded handwriting, Clara and Augustus, 1951. He had a wife, Margaret said softly. Robert found more photographs throughout the room. Augustus in military uniform, Augustus standing in front of half-built structures, Augustus shaking hands with men in suits, but no more pictures of Clara. The closet held men's clothes, suits from different decades, all cleaned and pressed, shoes Poland to mirrors, and at the back a locked trunk. Robert tried the keys Howard had given them. None fit. "We'll come back to that," Margaret said. They found the library on the second floor, and it took Margaret's breath away. It was easily 40 feet long, 2 stories tall with a balcony running the perimeter. Thousands of books, comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows, and in the center, a massive oak desk with a leather chair behind it. Robert walked to the desk while Margaret explored the shelves. He found journals, dozens of them lined up chronologically. He opened the one marked 1976. The handwriting was precise, controlled. Entries were dated, detailed. Robert read aloud, March 3, 1976. Completed final inventory. All items secured in primary vault. Secondary documentation filed in safe room. Protection protocols remain in place. The burden is heavier than I imagined, but the alternative is unthinkable. Margaret turned from the shelves. Vault? What vault? Robert flipped through more pages. April 7, 1976. Increased security on East Wing access. Locals asking questions. Maintaining cover as eccentric recluse serves its purpose, but trust no one. What lies below must remain hidden until the right person finds it. What lies below? Margaret repeated slowly. They spent the next hour reading through journals. Augustus wrote about his life, but always in guarded terms. References to the collection and what must be protected, and those who would misuse what I've recovered. He mentioned traveling extensively, acquiring items, bringing them back to the house. He wrote about trust and betrayal, about keeping secrets for the greater good. One entry from 1993 caught Margaret's attention. Clara would have known what to do. She always had the moral clarity I lacked. But she's been gone 20 years now, and I carry this alone. Sometimes I wonder if isolation is the price of protection, or if I've simply become a prisoner of my own making. Margaret's throat tightened. Augustus Whitmore had lived here alone for decades, guarding something, protecting something, carrying a burden he couldn't share. The sun was setting by the time they made it to the 3rd floor. Up here, the hallway was narrower, the rooms smaller, storage rooms filled with carefully labeled boxes, a workshop with tools organized by type and size, and at the end of the hall, a room that was completely empty except for a single chair facing the window. Margaret walked to the window. From here, you could see for miles. Forest stretched in every direction, broken only by the winding ribbon of Whitmore Ridge Road far below. "This is where he sat," she said quietly, watching, waiting. Robert stood beside her as darkness crept across the sky. Waiting for what? For whoever was supposed to come next, she turned to him. For us. They found bedrooms on the 2nd floor and decided to stay the night. It felt strange, sleeping in a dead man's house, but somehow it also felt necessary, like they needed to spend time here, to understand what Augustus had left them. Margaret couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m, she gave up trying, wrapped herself in a robe she'd found in the closet, and went back downstairs to the library. She lit the desk lamp and pulled out more journals, reading by the soft yellow light. She found an entry from 2008 that made her sit up straighter. Received notification that Clara's grandniece had a daughter, Margaret. The line continues. Watched from a distance as she grew, married, had children of her own. She chose a simple life, a good man, meaningful work. She understands what matters. When the time comes, she'll be the one. She'll know what to do with what I've protected. She'll have the integrity this burden requires. Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. Augustus had been watching her whole life, had chosen her decades ago, had believed in her when her own children didn't. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Robert in the doorway. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. "He knew about me, Robert. He'd been watching our family for years. He chose me specifically." Robert sat beside her, reading the entry. "But he never contacted you?" "No, he just watched and waited and trusted that when I found this place, I'd do the right thing." She looked around the library. But the right thing with what? What was he protecting? They spent the next day exploring with fresh eyes, looking not just at what was there but at what was strange, and the more they looked, the more they found. The doors throughout the house were unusually heavy, reinforced. Margaret noticed hinges that seemed over-engineered for simple interior doors. Robert discovered that several rooms had locks on the outside, like they were meant to keep people out rather than in. In the study off the main hallway, they found maps. Dozens of them covering walls, marked with pins and notations in multiple languages. Robert recognized some as German, French, Italian. The maps showed locations across Europe, North Africa, South America. Beside each pin, dates ranging from 1945 to 1975. He was tracking something, Robert said, studying the patterns, or searching for something. Margaret found a file cabinet in the corner, unlocked. Inside, folders labeled with names of cities, museums, private collections. Documents in languages she couldn't read, but with official-looking seals and stamps. Photographs of artifacts, paintings, sculptures. One folder was labeled simply, Recovered, 1946 to 1976. Inside were certificates of authenticity, bills of sale, shipping manifests, items acquired, transported, stored, but no indication of where they were stored. "This is starting to feel like something we shouldn't be touching," Margaret said quietly. Robert agreed, but Augustus wanted us to find it, whatever it is. That afternoon, they heard an engine. Margaret looked out the front window to see a pickup truck coming up the drive. An older man got out, maybe 70, wearing work clothes and a cautious expression. Robert opened the door before the man could knock. "Help you?" Robert asked. The man removed his cap. "Name's Earl Patterson. I'm the caretaker, or was. Howard DeWitt said the new owners might be here." He studied them. "You're the family, the inheritors?" "We are," Margaret said, stepping forward. "I'm Margaret. This is Robert." Earl nodded slowly. "Augustus hired me back in 1998. Paid me to maintain the exterior, keep the utilities running, make sure nobody broke in. Never let me pass the main floor, though. Some rooms I wasn't even allowed to look at." "Which rooms?" Robert asked. Earl shifted uncomfortably. "The study, the library, and the East Wing. He was real specific about that East Wing. Said there were things in there that weren't my concern, and I should respect that if I wanted to keep getting paid." Margaret glanced at Robert. They hadn't fully explored the East Wing yet. "You ever see anyone else here?" Robert asked. Earl's expression darkened. "Few times over the years, usually at night. Cars with out-of-state plates, sometimes foreign. They'd come up the drive, sit there for a while, then leave. Augustus told me if I ever saw anyone trying to get in, I was to call the sheriff immediately. Happened twice. Both times they were gone before the law arrived." "Who were they?" Margaret asked. "Don't know, but they weren't tourists." Earl looked past them into the house. "Augustus was a good man. Paid me fair, Never asked for more than I could give, but he was troubled, carrying something heavy. You could see it in his eyes. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Earl stayed for another hour, showing them the exterior features, the generator shed, the water system. He explained which contractors to call for what, which parts of the roof needed attention, but he kept glancing at the east wing like it made him nervous. "You going to stay here?" he asked finally. Margaret looked at Robert. They hadn't discussed it. "We might," Earl nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, I'm in town. But ma'am, Mr. Chen, I'll give you the same advice I'd give my own kids. Be careful in this house. Augustus wasn't hiding dust and memories. He was hiding something real, and whatever it is, people have been trying to find it for 40 years. After Earl left, Margaret and Robert stood in the main hallway, looking toward the east wing. "We need to see what's there," Margaret said. The east wing was accessed through a set of double doors near the library. They'd noticed them before but hadn't tried the handle. Now Robert turned it. Locked. He tried the keys Howard had given them. The third key fit. The doors opened to reveal a hallway different from the rest of the house. The walls here were reinforced concrete, painted to look like plaster. The floor was poured concrete, not hardwood, and every 20 feet, another locked door. They tried keys. Some worked, some didn't. The first room they opened was empty except for filing cabinets. Robert pulled open a drawer. Inside, files organized by year, going back to 1946. Each file contained photographs, documents, and detailed notes in Augustus's handwriting. Margaret pulled one at random. 1962, Vienna. Inside were photos of a painting. A landscape, beautiful, signed by an artist Margaret didn't recognize. Beneath the photos, a letter in German with an English translation clipped to it. The letter was from a museum, confirming the painting had been looted during World War II and never recovered. Augustus's notes read, "Acquired from private collector in Vienna. Original owner's family perished in camps. No surviving heirs. Painting authenticated. Stored in Vault 3 until proper disposition can be determined." Vault 3. Margaret looked at Robert. He was recovering stolen art. They spent the next 2 hours going through files, painting after painting, sculpture after sculpture, rare books, jewelry, religious artifacts, all stolen during the war, all recovered by Augustus, all documented, authenticated, and stored. "This is millions of dollars worth of art," Robert said, his voice shaking. "This is people's history," Margaret whispered. "Their heritage. Things that were stolen from them." They found Augustus's mission statement in a folder marked Purpose and Protocol. "I served in the Monuments Men during World War II," it read. "We were tasked with protecting and recovering cultural treasures stolen by the Nazis. After the war, I couldn't stop. So much was still missing. So many families had lost everything. I spent my life tracking, acquiring, and preserving what I could find. But the political landscape made returning items complicated. Countries destabilized, families scattered, museums corrupted. I chose to protect what I'd recovered until the right moment, the right person, could make proper restitution. This is not theft. This is guardianship. And whoever inherits this burden must understand the weight of it." Margaret sat down hard on the concrete floor. "Oh my God, this is why he chose us. This is why he needed someone with integrity." Robert knelt beside her. "Margaret, if this is real, if these items are what he says they are, this collection is worth—" "I don't care what it's worth," she said fiercely. "These things belong to people, to families, to cultures that had everything stolen from them." They kept exploring. The next room held ledgers. Each item in the collection was logged, date acquired, authentication documents, estimated value, known provenance, potential heirs or institutions for return. The organization was meticulous. Decades of work, a lifetime of careful documentation. The third room made them stop breathing. It was climate-controlled. They could hear the hum of the system. And along the walls, racks of paintings, dozens of them, maybe more than 100. Each one wrapped, labeled, catalogued. Robert approached the nearest one. Carefully, he unwrapped it. The painting was small, maybe 2 feet square. A woman in profile, Renaissance style, colors so rich they seemed to glow. In the corner, a signature Robert recognized even though he wasn't an art expert. "That's a Da Vinci," he whispered. Margaret came closer. "It can't be." But the label attached to the frame told the story. Leonardo da Vinci, portrait of unknown woman, circa 1500. Looted from private collection in Florence, 1943. Recovered Vienna, 1958. Authenticated by Dr. Hermann Schmidt, Zurich, 1959. Estimated value in current market, $40 to $60 million. Margaret backed away, her hand over her mouth. They went to the next painting, Caravaggio, then another, Rembrandt, another, Monet, Vermeer, names she'd only read in art history books. "This isn't just millions," Robert said, his voice barely audible. "This is hundreds of millions, maybe more." Margaret started to shake. "We need to call Howard. We need to call someone. This is too much. This is too big." They rushed back to the main house, Margaret's hands trembling so badly Robert had to dial Howard's number for her. The lawyer answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Chen, is everything all right?" "Mr. DeWitt, we found it. The collection, the vault. It's art. It's stolen art from World War II. There are paintings worth millions, maybe hundreds of millions." Silence on the other end, then Howard's voice, careful and measured. "You found the climate-controlled rooms in the East Wing." "You knew?" Margaret said. "I suspected. Augustus never confirmed the contents, but he paid me to ensure the temperature control systems were maintained, the security monitored. He trusted me with the logistics, not the details." "What do we do?" Margaret asked desperately. "Exactly what Augustus knew you would do," Howard said gently. "You read his documentation. You understand what he was trying to accomplish. Now you have to decide how to finish what he started." "But we can't just have this. We can't just own stolen art." "You don't own it, Mrs. Chen. You're the guardian of it. There's a difference. Augustus spent 50 years trying to figure out how to return these items properly. He never found a perfect solution. That's why he needed someone else, someone who would care more about doing the right thing than about the money." Margaret sank into a chair. "Our children. If they find out about this—" "Do they need to know right now?" Howard asked. Margaret looked at Robert. No, they don't." That night, they sat in the library, unable to process what they'd discovered, a collection of stolen art worth possibly $200 million or more, a responsibility so enormous it made Margaret dizzy. "We could walk away," Robert said quietly. "Sign it all over to a museum. Let them deal with it." "Augustus didn't leave it to a museum," Margaret said. "He left it to us, to me, because he thought I'd do the right thing." "What is the right thing?" Margaret looked at the journals spread across the desk. "I don't know yet, but I think we need to stay here for a while. I think we need to understand what Augustus was trying to do, and then we need to figure out how to finish it." They spent the next 3 days reading every journal, every file, every piece of documentation. Augustus had been thorough. He'd tracked down original owners when possible. He'd documented which items had been claimed by various governments. He'd identified pieces that belonged in specific museums versus pieces that should be returned to families. But the politics were complicated. Some countries wanted to claim everything. Some families had disappeared. Some items were disputed by multiple parties. Augustus had been paralyzed by the impossibility of perfect justice. So he'd protected everything, until someone else could try. On the fourth day, Margaret found the letter. It was in the master bedroom, tucked into the pages of the last journal Augustus had written. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Margaret opened it with shaking hands. "Dear inheritor," it began. "If you're reading this, you found what I spent my life protecting. I hope it hasn't overwhelmed you. I hope you understand why I did this. During the war, I saw the worst of humanity. But I also saw the best. I saw people risk everything to save art, to preserve culture, to protect beauty when the world was burning. I couldn't let that sacrifice mean nothing. So I continued the work. I recovered what I could. I protected what I found. But I was one man with limited resources and unlimited obstacles. I couldn't return everything properly. I couldn't navigate the politics and the greed and the competing claims. So I've given this burden to you, not because I want to make your life difficult, but because I believe you'll care more about doing right than about being right. The documentation is thorough, the authentication is solid, the items are real. What you do with them is entirely your choice. But I'd ask you to remember this. These aren't just objects. They're pieces of people's souls. They're family heirlooms and cultural treasures, and the last remaining traces of lives that were stolen. Treat them with the reverence they deserve. And when you've done what you can, when you've returned what you're able to return, know that you've completed something that mattered more than money, more than legacy, more than anything else I could have left behind. Thank you for being the person I hoped you'd be. Augustus Whitmore. Margaret read the letter 3 times before she could speak. When she finally looked up at Robert, tears were streaming down her face. "He trusted us," she whispered. "A man we never met trusted us with his life's work." Robert took her hand. "So what do we do?" Margaret thought about their children, who'd abandoned them for not giving up their home. She thought about Sarah's greed, David's calculations, Jennifer's dismissal. She thought about a lifetime of being taken for granted, of having her integrity questioned, of being told she was losing her mind. And then she thought about Augustus Whitmore, alone in this mansion for decades, carrying a burden too heavy for one person, waiting for someone who would understand what mattered. "We stay," she said firmly. "We move here. We figure this out. We finish what he started. Our children will fight us. Let them." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that reminded her why she'd married him 50 years ago. "Okay then, let's do it." That night, as they lay in the massive 4-poster bed in the master suite, Margaret stared up at the ceiling and thought about the weight of what they'd inherited. Not the money, not the property, but the responsibility, the trust, the belief that she, Margaret Chen, a 72-year-old woman disowned by her own children, was capable of something great. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and in the climate-controlled rooms of the East Wing, millions of dollars in stolen art waited patiently for justice it had been denied for 80 years. Margaret didn't know how they'd do it yet, didn't know who to contact or how to navigate the complexity, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Augustus Whitmore had chosen well. The morning after they decided to stay, Margaret woke to find Robert already dressed, sitting at the desk in the master bedroom with a notebook and Augustus's journals spread before him. "Been up long?" she asked, stretching. "Since 5, he said, not looking up. "I've been going through the inventory ledgers. Margaret, there's more. There are 4 more rooms we haven't opened yet." Her pulse quickened. 4 more? He nodded, showing her the hand-drawn map Augustus had included in one of the journals. The East Wing had 7 climate-controlled rooms total. They'd only explored 3. After breakfast, they returned to the East Wing with flashlights and the remaining keys. The 4th room took 3 tries to unlock, and when the door finally swung open, they understood why it had extra security. This room was smaller but more densely packed. Glass cases lined the walls, each one containing jewelry. Not costume jewelry, but pieces that belonged in museums. Ornate necklaces with stones the size of quarters, rings that caught the light like captured stars, brooches and tiaras and ceremonial pieces that whispered of royalty and wealth beyond comprehension. Each case had documentation, family names, dates of theft, countries of origin, estimated values that made Margaret's head spin. One necklace, emerald set in platinum, had a note card that read, "Property of the Rothstein family, Vienna. Stolen 1938. Family perished. No surviving heirs located. Estimated value, $8.5 million. $8.5 million, Margaret whispered. For one necklace. Robert was reading other cards. This one's 12 million, this one's 6. Margaret, just in this room alone, there's probably $80 million worth of jewelry. The fifth room held sculptures. Bronze, marble, ancient pieces that Augustus had somehow tracked down and recovered. A Greek statue from the 2nd century. Roman busts, pieces that should have been in the Louvre or the British Museum. The 6th room was perhaps the most heartbreaking. It held personal items, family Bibles, prayer books, children's toys, photographs in silver frames, menorahs, wedding rings. Items that had no monetary value but meant everything to the people they'd been stolen from. Augustus had written extensively about this room. Margaret found a journal entry from 1987 that explained, "These items haunt me most: a child's doll, a grandmother's recipe book, a father's reading glasses. I recovered them from estate sales and private collections, items that had been looted from homes before families were taken to camps. They're worth nothing to collectors but everything to descendants. I've tried to find the families. Most are gone. All are scattered. I keep these items as a reminder of why this matters. This isn't about art or money. It's about lives that were stolen." Margaret sat on the floor of that room and cried, not delicate tears, but deep sobs that came from somewhere primal. Robert held her, and they wept together for people they'd never met, for families destroyed, for a man who'd spent his entire life trying to make things right. The 7th room was the largest, and when they opened it, they understood the true scope of what Augustus had protected. Paintings covered every wall, floor to ceiling. Racks in the center held more. Sculptures occupied every corner. This was the main vault, the heart of the collection. Robert started counting, then gave up. There have to be 200 pieces in here, maybe more. They spent hours documenting, photographing, reading labels. Rembrandt, Vermeer, Titian, Raphael, names that belonged in art history textbooks, not in a hidden room in a mansion in the woods. Margaret found Augustus's master ledger on a table near the door. It was leather-bound, thick, filled with meticulous handwriting. The final page had a summary dated December 15, 2023, just months before Augustus died. Total items in collection, 478. Authenticated paintings, 212. Authenticated sculptures, 67. Jewelry pieces, 93. Personal items, 89. Rare manuscripts and documents, 17. Current estimated total value based on recent auction results and authentication updates, $290 million. Margaret's hand shook so badly she had to set the ledger down. $290 million, she said aloud, needing to hear it to believe it. Robert sat beside her, his face pale. "We're 72 and 74 years old. We drive a 15-year-old car. Our net worth before this was maybe $180,000 if you count the house. And now we're responsible for $290 million in stolen art." "We're not responsible for the money," Margaret said quietly. "We're responsible for the justice." They found Augustus's complete story in a leather portfolio in the master ledger. He'd written it like a confession, like he needed someone to understand not just what he'd done, but why. "My name is Augustus Whitmore," it began. "I was born in 1921 in Boston to a family of modest means. My father was a banker, my mother taught piano. I studied art history at Harvard, graduating in 1942. I immediately enlisted. By 1943, I was in Europe with a special unit called the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Program. We called ourselves the Monuments Men. Our job was to protect cultural treasures from destruction during the war and recover what the Nazis had looted. I saw things during those years that changed me forever. I watched the Nazis systematically steal the cultural heritage of entire countries. Not just from museums, but from private homes. They took everything: paintings, sculptures, jewelry, Torah scrolls, family heirlooms. They stole people's history before they stole their lives. When the war ended, we'd recovered millions of items, but it was chaos. Countries destroyed, borders redrawn, families scattered or gone entirely. We did our best, but so much remained missing. I couldn't let it go. After my service ended, I used my inheritance to continue the work privately. I spent the next 30 years tracking stolen items, buying them from collectors who didn't know or didn't care where they'd come from, recovering them from estate sales and black markets. I brought everything here to this house I built specifically to protect what I found. My wife Clara supported me until her death in 1973. After that, I worked alone. I tried to return items. I contacted governments, museums, surviving family members when I could find them. But politics complicated everything. Countries claimed items that should have gone to families. Corrupt officials seized things that should have gone to museums. Collectors sued, lawyers argued. I realized that in trying to do right, I might make things worse. So I chose to wait. To protect everything until someone with no political agenda, no financial need, no personal stake could make the decisions I couldn't. I chose to hide $290 million in cultural treasures because releasing them into the current system would have meant many ended up in the wrong hands again. I know how this sounds. I know it looks like hoarding, like theft itself, but I swear on Clara's memory and my own soul, I never profited from any of this. Every penny I spent on recovery came from my inheritance. I lived modestly, worked quietly, and carried this burden alone for 50 years. If you're reading this, you're the person I've been waiting for. You're the one who will finish what I started. Trust the documentation. Trust the authentication. But most of all, trust your own moral compass. These items deserve to go home. Help them get there. Augustus Whitmore, December 23, 2023. Margaret closed the portfolio and sat in silence for a long time. "He died alone," she finally said, "carrying all of this, knowing he'd never see it through." Robert squeezed her hand, but he trusted it would be finished. That evening, they were in the kitchen making dinner when they heard it. A car engine, low and powerful, coming up the drive. Margaret looked at Robert. "Earl said he wasn't coming back this week." Robert moved to the window. "That's not Earl's truck." A black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, expensive, new, with tinted windows. The engine cut off, but no one got out. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Should we call someone?" "And say what? Someone's parked in our driveway?" They waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. Then the SUV's door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-50s, expensive suit, dark overcoat. He looked at the house like he was appraising it, then walked to the front door and knocked. Robert opened it, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" Robert asked. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Chen, I presume? My name is Anton Volkov. I'm an art collector and historian. I'd like to speak with you about Augustus Whitmore's estate." Margaret came up behind Robert. "How did you know we were here?" "Small towns talk, Mrs. Chen. A new caretaker mentioned the inheritors had arrived. I've been waiting a long time for this opportunity." "What opportunity?" Robert asked. Volkov's smile widened slightly. "The opportunity to discuss acquiring certain items from Mr. Whitmore's collection. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer." "The house isn't for sale," Margaret said. "I'm not interested in the house," Volkov said smoothly. "I'm interested in what's inside it, specifically what's inside the East Wing." Margaret's blood ran cold. Volkov continued. Mr. Whitmore and I had conversations over the years. He knew I was interested in his collection. He refused to negotiate, but he acknowledged its existence. Now that he's passed, I'm hoping his heirs might be more reasonable. You need to leave, Robert said firmly. Volkov reached into his coat, and Robert tensed, but the man only pulled out a business card. He slipped it through the crack in the door. Think about it. I'm staying at the Pine Lodge in town. I can offer you $10 million cash, no questions asked, for first viewing rights. After that, we can negotiate individual pieces. He paused. I should mention, I'm not the only collector who knows about this place, but I'm the only one polite enough to knock first. He walked back to his SUV and drove away, gravel crunching under expensive tires. Margaret looked at the business card. Anton Volkov, Private Acquisitions, an address in Zurich. A phone number with a Swiss country code. He threatened us, she whispered. That last part was a threat. Robert locked the door and checked every window on the first floor. We need to call Howard. The lawyer answered immediately. When Robert explained what had happened, Howard swore, something Robert suspected the elderly attorney rarely did. Anton Volkov, Howard said. Augustus mentioned him. He's legitimate in the sense that he deals in real art, but his ethics are questionable at best. He's been sniffing around this property for 20 years. He knew about the collection, Margaret said. How? Word gets around in certain circles. Augustus was careful, but he wasn't invisible. Every time he authenticated a piece or made discreet inquiries about provenance, people noticed. Collectors like Volkov have been watching this place for decades. What do we do? Robert asked. Document everything. Photograph every interaction. And for God's sake, don't let anyone inside. Augustus put security on this place for a reason. The alarm system should still work. Earl can show you how to arm it. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Volkov's cold smile, kept hearing his words. I'm not the only one. At 3 a.m, she heard something, a soft scraping sound, metal on metal. She shook Robert awake. Someone's here. They moved quietly to the window. In the moonlight, they could see a figure near the east wing entrance, working on the lock with tools. Robert grabbed his phone to call 911, but Margaret stopped him. Wait, watch. The figure worked for another minute, then the lock clicked. The door swung open. Now call, Margaret said. Robert dialed. 911, what's your emergency? Someone just broke into our home, Whitmore Estate, Whitmore Ridge Road. The dispatcher's voice was calm but concerned. Deputies are 20 minutes away, sir. Are you and your wife safe? We're upstairs. The intruder is on the first floor, east wing. Stay where you are. Lock yourselves in a room. Help is coming. They locked the bedroom door and waited. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. 15 minutes felt like hours. Then they heard it. A crash downstairs, shouting, footsteps running, car tires on gravel speeding away. Silence. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights washed across the walls. Deputies arrived, 3 of them led by a man who introduced himself as Sheriff Tom Warren. They searched the house thoroughly. The east wing door had been picked, but nothing appeared missing. The intruder had fled when Robert called 911, probably monitoring police frequencies. Sheriff Warren took their statement, examined the forced lock, and looked troubled. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, he said carefully, I have to ask, is there anything in this house that might attract this kind of attention? Margaret and Robert exchanged glances. We inherited the property recently, Robert said. We're still figuring out what's here. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. Augustus Whitmore was an interesting man, kept to himself, but there were always rumors. People said he had valuable things in this house, art maybe, rare items. We wouldn't know, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. The sheriff didn't look convinced, but he nodded. I'll increase patrols on this road, and I'd suggest you get better locks, maybe cameras. After the deputies left, Margaret and Robert sat in the kitchen, shaking with adrenaline. "They know," Margaret said. "Volkov knows. The sheriff suspects. How long before everyone knows?" "We need help," Robert said. "Real help. Lawyers, security, people who understand what we're dealing with." The next morning, they called Howard and explained everything. The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to give you a number," he said finally. "It's for a firm in New York that specializes in art recovery and restitution. They work with Holocaust survivors, museums, governments. If anyone can help you navigate this, they can. But Margaret, Robert, you need to understand. Once you make that call, once this becomes official, your lives will change completely." "They're already changing," Margaret said. "We were broken into last night." "Then make the call, and in the meantime, I'm driving up there. You shouldn't be alone." Howard arrived that evening with Earl in tow. Together, they installed new locks, activated the security system Augustus had installed decades ago, and set up cameras at every entrance. Augustus was paranoid, Earl explained as he showed them the control panel. But maybe he had reason to be. That night, with Howard sleeping in one of the guest rooms and the security system armed, Margaret finally felt safe enough to rest. But at 2 a.m, the alarm went off. They scrambled awake. The control panel showed motion at the back entrance. The cameras displayed 2 figures in dark clothes, one working on the door while the other stood watch. Robert called 911 again. Howard grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet. Earl appeared with a shotgun. "I don't want to shoot anyone," Earl said, "but I will if they get inside." This time the intruders didn't run. They got the back door open and entered the house. Howard yelled, "We've called the police. We're armed. Leave now." Footsteps in the hallway, running toward the east wing. Earl fired a shot into the ceiling. The boom was deafening in the enclosed space. The footsteps stopped, then reversed. 2 men in ski masks ran past, headed for the exit. Earl didn't shoot again, just stood there, barrel pointed at the door. The men disappeared into the night. Sirens wailed in the distance. Sheriff Warren arrived with 4 deputies this time. They found tools left behind, professional lockpicking equipment. One deputy discovered a van parked a quarter-mile down the road, stolen plates, empty. "This is escalating," the sheriff said, his expression grave. "Twice in 2 days. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, I'm going to ask you directly. What's in this house that people are willing to commit felonies to access?" Margaret looked at Robert, at Howard, at Earl. She made a decision. "Sheriff, I think you should sit down," they told him. Not everything, but enough. Augustus's work recovering stolen art, the collection in the East Wing, the estimated value, the attention it was attracting. The sheriff's face went pale. $290 million? In this house? Yes. Jesus Christ. He ran his hand through his hair. You need federal protection. This is way beyond local law enforcement. We've contacted art recovery specialists in New York, Howard said. They're sending people. Good. In the meantime, I'll post a deputy here round the clock. But Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, you need to understand. Word is going to get out. It probably already is. And when it does, you're going to have more than late-night break-ins to worry about. He was right. The next afternoon, 3 cars pulled up the driveway simultaneously. Margaret looked out the window and her stomach dropped. Sarah's Mercedes, David's BMW, Jennifer's Audi. All 3 of their children had arrived. They know, Margaret said. Robert's jaw tightened. Of course they do. Money has a smell, and they've always been good at tracking it. The children didn't knock. Sarah still had that old key, and she used it, walking in with David and Jennifer behind her like an invading force. "Mom, Dad," Sarah called out, "where are you?" Margaret and Robert descended the stairs slowly. Howard and Earl emerged from the library. Sarah stopped when she saw the mansion's interior, her mouth actually falling open. "What the hell is this place?" Our inheritance, Margaret said coolly. What are you doing here? David stepped forward, phone in hand. We got a call from a concerned citizen who said you were in danger. Break-ins, police calls, we came to check on you. Concerned citizen, Robert repeated. Or concerned about what we might have inherited. Jennifer's eyes were scanning the room, pricing everything. This house is enormous. How much is it worth? It's ours, Margaret said. That's all you need to know. Sarah's expression shifted from shock to calculation. Mum, Dad, we need to talk. Clearly you've inherited something significant. You're going to need help managing this. Legal help, financial help. And we're your children. We should be involved. You disowned us, Margaret said, her voice like steel. You called us incompetent. You told the whole family we were losing our minds. You blocked our numbers and returned our mail. We were worried, David said quickly. We thought... You thought you could bully us into giving up our home, Robert interrupted. And when we didn't, you cut us off. Now you want back in because you think there's money involved. This is family property, Sarah said, her voice rising. We have a right to know what's going on. No, Margaret said simply. You don't. Jennifer's face reddened. You're being ridiculous. You can't possibly manage something like this yourselves. You're old. You need our help. We're managing just fine, Robert said. Howard stepped forward. I'm Howard DeWitt, the estate attorney. Perhaps I can clarify. The inheritance was left specifically to Margaret Chen, as the sole blood relative of Augustus Whitmore. There is no provision for her children in the will. Legally, they have no claim to any of this. Sarah whirled on him. That can't be legal. We're her heirs. When she passes, yes, Howard said calmly. But the property and its contents are hers to do with as she pleases. You have no legal standing here. David's phone was already out. We'll see about that. We can contest the will. We can argue undue influence. You can try, Howard said, but you'll lose. The will is ironclad. The arguing escalated. Voices raised. Accusations flew. Sarah called Margaret selfish. David threatened legal action. Jennifer actually started crying, saying they were being cut out of the family again. And through it all, Margaret stood firm. You need to leave, she said finally, her voice cutting through the noise. This is my home. You're not welcome here. Mom, Sarah started. No, you made your choice when you abandoned us. You don't get to come back now that you think there's something to gain. Leave. We're not leaving, David said. We have every right. You have no rights here, Robert said, stepping beside Margaret. This is private property. You weren't invited. Leave, or we'll call the sheriff. Fine, Sarah shouted. Keep your secrets, but when you die, everything goes to us anyway. We can wait. The casual cruelty of it, the open admission that they were just waiting for their parents to die, hit Margaret like a physical blow. Get out, she whispered. Get out of my house. They left in a storm of slammed doors and threats about lawyers. Margaret collapsed into a chair, shaking. That was our children, she said, tears streaming down her face. Our children, who we raised, who we loved, just told us they're waiting for us to die so they can take what's ours. Robert held her while she sobbed. Howard and Earl tactfully retreated to give them privacy. But the damage was done. If the children knew, then others would know soon. The secret was out. That night Margaret's phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her. Mrs. Chen? A smooth, accented voice. Anton Volkov. I hope I'm not calling too late. How did you get this number? That's not important. What's important is that we talk. I've raised my offer to $15 million for first viewing, and I'd suggest you take it. I'm not interested. You should be, because the alternative is that less civilized collectors get involved. People who won't bother with offers. People who will simply take what they want. Margaret's blood ran cold. Is that a threat? It's a reality. The word is out, Mrs. Chen. Everyone knows Augustus's collection is in play. Everyone knows two elderly people are trying to protect $290 million worth of art. You can't stop what's coming, but you can profit from it. Think about my offer. You have 48 hours. He hung up. Margaret looked at Robert, her hands shaking. He just threatened us. He said people are coming, people who will just take it. Robert pulled her close. Then we make sure they can't. The next morning, two black Escalades pulled up the driveway. Margaret's heart raced until she saw the logo on the door, Rakowski Art Recovery and Restitution. 4 people emerged. 3 men in suits, 1 woman in professional attire. The woman approached first, hand extended. Mrs. Chen, I'm Susan Rakowski. Howard DeWitt called us. I understand you have a situation. That was the understatement of the century. They spent the next 6 hours going through everything. Susan and her team photographed documents, examined the collection, verified authenticity marks. Their expressions shifted from professional interest to barely contained shock as the scope became clear. This is the most significant private recovery collection I've ever seen, Susan said finally. Augustus Whitmore spent 50 years doing what governments couldn't, and now it's all sitting here, vulnerable, with the entire underground art world circling like sharks. What do we do? Margaret asked. Susan looked at her seriously. You have 3 options. 1, you sell everything to someone like Volkov and walk away with millions but zero moral satisfaction. 2, you turn it over to the government and let them sort it out, which will take decades and likely result in political squabbling rather than proper restitution. Or 3, you work with us to properly catalogue, authenticate, and return every single item to its rightful place, which will be the hardest thing you've ever done, will take years, will cost you personally in ways you can't imagine, but will actually honor what Augustus tried to accomplish. Margaret didn't hesitate. Option 3. Susan smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, but you need to know what you're up against. Collectors like Volkov won't stop. The break-ins will continue. Your children will sue. The media will descend. Governments will make claims. It's going to be brutal. We've already been disowned by our children and broken into twice, Robert said. How much worse can it get? Susan's expression turned grim. You'd be surprised. She was right to warn them. That very night, everything fell apart. The media arrived first. 3 news vans parked at the base of the driveway at 6 in the morning, cameras rolling, reporters calling out questions that Margaret and Robert couldn't hear from inside the house. Susan Rakowski had warned them this would happen. Once we file the initial documentation with the International Art Recovery Database, it becomes public record. Every news outlet looking for a headline will descend. She hadn't been exaggerating. By noon, there were 7 news vans. By evening, a helicopter circled overhead. Margaret watched from the library window as reporters set up camps on the road just outside the property line, waiting for a statement, a photo, anything. The headlines started appearing online within hours. Elderly couple discovers $300 million Nazi loot in inherited mansion. The number kept growing with each article, as if the truth wasn't sensational enough. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Reporters, distant relatives she'd never heard of, people claiming to be descendants of original owners, lawyers offering services, collectors making offers. It was overwhelming. Susan's team worked through it all, setting up a command center in the dining room. Computers, phones, filing systems. They'd brought in a security team too, 4 former military personnel who positioned themselves strategically around the property. This is necessary, Susan explained when Margaret expressed discomfort at having armed guards. We've had 3 attempted break-ins in as many days. Volkov is just the tip of the iceberg. There are people out there who would kill for access to this collection. The words hung heavy. Kill. Robert found Margaret that night sitting in Augustus's study, looking at the portrait above the fireplace. "You're wondering if we made the right choice," he said quietly. "I'm wondering if we're going to survive it," she admitted. "Robert, we're in our 70s. We should be playing with grandchildren and taking walks and enjoying retirement. Instead, we're guarding $300 million in stolen art from criminals and our own children." "Our grandchildren don't visit us," Robert reminded her gently. "Sarah won't let them. Says we're a bad influence." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Because we won't give her money." He sat beside her. "Augustus lived with this for 50 years, alone. At least we have each other, and now we have Susan's team. We're not alone in this. But what if we fail? What if, despite everything, these pieces end up in the wrong hands?" Robert took her hand. "Then we'll have tried. That's more than most people can say." The lawsuit started on day 4. David filed first, arguing that Margaret was mentally incompetent and the inheritance should be placed in a conservatorship managed by her children. He'd found a doctor willing to state that anyone over 70 making major financial decisions without family consultation showed signs of diminished capacity. Sarah filed separately, claiming that as the eldest child, she had a right to oversee the estate for her mother's protection. Jennifer's lawsuit was the most hurtful. She argued that the stress of the inheritance was damaging Margaret's health and that the children should be granted power of attorney to protect their mother from herself. Howard DeWitt handled all 3 with cold efficiency. "These are harassment suits," he told Margaret and Robert. "They won't succeed legally, but they'll tie up time and resources, which is exactly what your children want." "Why?" Margaret asked, though she knew the answer. "Because if they can't have the collection, they'll make it as difficult as possible for you to do anything with it. They're hoping you'll get exhausted and give up, sign everything over to them just to make it stop." "That won't happen," Margaret said firmly. But the legal battles took their toll. Depositions, medical examinations to prove competency, interviews with psychologists. It was invasive, exhausting, and designed to break her spirit. The children showed up to every hearing, dressed professionally, speaking with concern about their poor mother, who was clearly being manipulated by unscrupulous lawyers and art dealers. The judge saw through it. Margaret would never forget the moment in court when Sarah was testifying about her mother's supposed confusion. "And when did you last visit your mother before this inheritance?" the judge asked. Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure of the exact date." "Approximately." "Several months ago. We had a disagreement about her living situation." "By disagreement, do you mean you tried to force her to sell her home and move to assisted living against her will?" Sarah's face reddened. "We were concerned for her safety. And when she refused, you blocked her phone number, told family members she was showing signs of cognitive decline, and cut off all contact. Is that correct?" "Your Honor, we were—" "Answer the question, please." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Yes." The judge looked at Margaret, who sat straight-backed and clear-eyed in the gallery. "Mrs. Chen, please approach." Margaret walked to the witness stand. "Mrs. Chen, can you tell me in your own words why you refused to sell your home?" Margaret's voice was steady. "Because it was my home. My husband and I had lived there for 43 years. We raised our children there. We weren't ready to give it up just because our children found it inconvenient to worry about us." "And can you explain your understanding of the inheritance you received?" "Augustus Whitmore was my great-uncle, though I never met him. He left me a property and its contents. The contents turned out to be a collection of artwork and cultural items stolen during World War II that he spent his life recovering. The collection is valued at approximately $290 million. My intention is to work with art recovery specialists to return every item to its rightful owner or institution." The judge nodded slowly. "And your children believe you're not capable of making this decision?" "My children believe they should make it for me. There's a difference." "Indeed there is." The judge looked at David, Sarah, and Jennifer. Petition denied. Mrs. Margaret Chen has demonstrated complete mental competency. This court finds no basis for conservatorship or power of attorney. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing the petitioners from harassing Mrs. Chen or interfering with her legal business. Court adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. Outside the courthouse, Sarah tried to approach. "Mum, please, we just want to help." "No," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "You want to control. You want the money. You want to make decisions for me because you've never respected that I'm capable of making them myself." "That's not fair," Jennifer cried. "Isn't it?" Margaret looked at her youngest daughter. "You returned my birthday card. You changed your address so I couldn't write to you. You told your children that Grandma and Grandpa were too old and confused to visit. And now you stand here pretending you care." David stepped forward. "Mom, we're your children. We're family." "Family doesn't abandon you when you don't obey," Robert said, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "Family doesn't sue you for being independent. You made your choice. Now live with it." They walked away, leaving their children standing on the courthouse steps. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, Margaret just felt tired. But the legal victory meant they could move forward. Susan's team had been working around the clock, and now they could act. The first returns happened quietly. A painting that had been stolen from a Jewish family in Amsterdam was returned to their descendants, 3 sisters in their 80s living in Tel Aviv. Susan's team arranged everything: authentication, transport, legal transfer. Margaret and Robert watched via video call as the sisters saw the painting for the first time. It had hung in their grandmother's dining room before the Nazis came. They'd thought it was lost forever. The eldest sister, her hands shaking, touched the frame and wept. "This was the last thing I saw before they took us away. My grandmother made me memorize it. She said, 'Remember beauty, no matter what comes.' I remembered. For 80 years I remembered." Margaret cried, watching it. This was why Augustus had spent his life on this work. Not for money, not for glory, but for moments like this. The returns continued. A Torah scroll to a synagogue in Prague, jewelry to a family in Paris, sculptures to museums in Rome and Athens. Each return was documented, celebrated, mourned for the years lost. But not everyone wanted things returned. Governments began making claims. Poland wanted items that had been in private collections before the war. Russia claimed anything that had passed through Soviet territories. Lawyers argued about ownership, about statute of limitations, about which claims were valid. Susan's team navigated it all with patience and precision. "This is why Augustus waited," she explained to Margaret. "He knew it would be complicated. But you're doing what he couldn't. You're making the hard calls." One particular case haunted Margaret for weeks. A Vermeer painting worth $42 million had 3 competing claims. The Dutch government argued it had been stolen from a national museum. A private family in Belgium claimed it had been looted from their estate. And a collector in New York insisted he'd purchased it legally in 1958, before anyone knew it was stolen. Margaret spent sleepless nights reviewing documentation, consulting with experts, trying to determine the most just outcome. The pressure was immense. One wrong decision could set a precedent that affected hundreds of other cases. In the end, the evidence pointed to the Belgian family. Their documentation was thorough, their claim legitimate. But returning it meant the New York collector, an 80-year-old man who'd bought the painting in good faith 67 years ago, would lose millions. Margaret made the call herself. She flew to New York to tell him in person. The collector's name was Ernest Goldman. He invited her into his penthouse apartment, where the Vermeer hung in a place of honor above his fireplace. "I've been expecting this," he said quietly. "I knew when I saw the news about your collection that mine might be part of it." "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "You purchased it legally. You didn't know." Ernest smiled sadly. "I suspected, though, even back then. The price was too good, the seller too eager, but I was young and wanted it so badly." He looked at the painting. "I've loved it for 67 years, but it was never really mine, was it?" "No," Margaret said gently. "It belongs to the Dubois family, or what's left of them." Ernest nodded. "Then it should go home." He paused. "Will you tell them something for me? Tell them it was loved. Tell them it was cherished. Tell them even though I had no right to it, I protected it, kept it safe. Maybe that counts for something." Margaret's throat tightened. "It counts for everything." The painting was returned to the Dubois family's last surviving member, a woman in her 90s living in Brussels. When she saw it, she collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking. "My father loved this painting more than anything," she whispered. "When they took him, he begged them to spare it. They laughed and took it anyway. He died in the camps thinking his beloved Vermeer was destroyed or lost forever." She looked up at Margaret with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for bringing him peace, even if he's not here to see it." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. The threats, the lawsuits, the sleepless nights, all of it faded when Margaret saw what returning these items meant to people. 6 months into the process, they'd successfully returned 87 items worth approximately $40 million. The remaining collection was still valued at over $250 million. That's when the real danger started. Margaret was working in the library one afternoon when she heard shouting from the security team. She rushed to the window and saw 3 vehicles blocking the driveway. Not police, not reporters. Men in tactical gear. "Get to the safe room," one of the security guards yelled. "Now!" Robert grabbed Margaret's hand and they ran. Augustus had built a safe room behind the library, reinforced concrete, secure communications. They'd practiced this drill. They locked themselves in and waited. Gunfire erupted outside. Not a lot, just warning shots, shouting in multiple languages. Then silence. 30 minutes later, Susan's voice came through the intercom. "It's safe. You can come out." The attempted raid had been sophisticated. 8 men, professional equipment, clearly planning to breach the house and take what they could. The security team had repelled them, and local law enforcement had arrested 5. 3 escaped. Sheriff Warren was grim when he arrived. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, this has escalated beyond what local police can handle. I've contacted the FBI." The federal agents arrived the next day. They set up operations, installed surveillance, brought in additional security. The Whitmore estate became a fortress. "You're protecting evidence in a major international art theft recovery," Agent Melissa Torres explained. "This collection represents one of the most significant finds in modern history. There are people who would do anything to acquire pieces from it." "We just want to return things to their rightful owners," Margaret said wearily. "I know, and we're going to help you do that safely." But safety came at a cost. The house that had briefly felt like a haven now felt like a prison. Guards at every entrance, cameras everywhere. Margaret and Robert couldn't leave without security escorts. "This isn't a life," Margaret said one night, lying in bed beside Robert. "We're 72 and 74 years old, living in an armed compound." "It's temporary," Robert said. "Once enough items are returned, once the collection is smaller, the pressure will ease." "Will it? Or will collectors just fight harder for what remains?" He had no answer. The breaking point came 2 months later. Margaret received a call from the hospital. Howard DeWitt had been in a car accident, hit and run. He was in critical condition. The police investigation revealed tampering with his brake lines. It wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to kill him. Margaret sat beside Howard's hospital bed, holding his hand. The elderly lawyer was unconscious, breathing through tubes, his face swollen with bruises. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. The inheritance, the collection, I brought this into your life." Howard's eyes fluttered open. His voice was weak but clear. "Not your fault. My choice. Would do it again. You could have died. So could Augustus, every day for 50 years, but he kept going because it mattered. Howard squeezed her hand weakly. Finish it, Margaret. Make it mean something. The attack on Howard galvanized something in Margaret. Fear transformed into fury, and fury into absolute determination. She called a press conference. Susan tried to talk her out of it. It's dangerous. You'll be making yourself a target. I'm already a target. At least this way, I control the narrative. The press conference was held at the courthouse with FBI protection. Every major news outlet attended. Margaret stood at the podium, Robert beside her, and faced the cameras. My name is Margaret Chen, she began. 6 months ago, I inherited a property from Augustus Whitmore, a man I never met. What I discovered was a lifetime of work recovering cultural items stolen during World War II. Items worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Items that belonged to families, to communities, to cultures that had everything taken from them. She paused, letting that sink in. Since that discovery, I've been threatened, sued by my own children, had my home broken into multiple times, and a dear friend was nearly killed. People want this collection for its monetary value. They see dollar signs where there should be respect for human tragedy. Her voice strengthened. I'm here to say that not one single item from Augustus Whitmore's collection will be sold for profit. Not one piece will end up in a private collection or a black market sale. Every single item will be authenticated, documented, and returned to its rightful place. This will take years. It will cost millions in legal fees and security and authentication. I don't care. My husband and I will dedicate the rest of our lives to finishing what Augustus started. Reporters shouted questions. She ignored them. To the collectors circling this estate, you will not get what you want. To my children who've sued me for control, you will get nothing. This isn't about money or inheritance or family fights. This is about justice delayed for 80 years, and if people want to threaten me or try to stop me, they'll fail, because I'm a 72-year-old woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She stepped away from the podium. The room erupted with questions, but she and Robert walked out, surrounded by federal agents. The press conference went viral. Within hours, it had millions of views. The headlines shifted from sensational treasure hunt stories to something deeper. Elderly couple fights to return Holocaust-looted art. Woman chooses justice over fortune. The moral inheritance, support poured in. Holocaust survivors contacted them with stories and gratitude. Museums offered assistance. Legitimate art historians volunteered their expertise. Governments that had been making political claims suddenly backed off, unwilling to look bad fighting against an elderly couple trying to do the right thing. And something else happened. The threats stopped. Volkov sent one final message. You've made this too public, too political. There's no profit in fighting you now. Congratulations on your moral victory. The tone was bitter, but it was capitulation. The attempted break-ins ceased. The suspicious vehicles disappeared. Slowly, incrementally, the siege mentality began to lift. Howard recovered, though it took months. He came back to work with a cane and renewed determination. The first day back, he brought Margaret a small package. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a leather journal, old and worn. Augustus's handwriting filled the pages, but this wasn't about art recovery. These were personal entries. Thoughts about Clara, reflections on loneliness, hopes for whoever would continue his work. One entry from 2015 read, I am 84 years old. Clara has been gone 42 years. I have no children, no close family, only this work. Some nights I wonder if it was worth it. The isolation, the fear, the burden. Then I remember the faces of people who lost everything. I remember what I'm protecting and why. If Margaret Chen ever reads this, I hope she understands. The loneliness was worth it. The sacrifice mattered, and I would do it all again. Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Where did you find this? In my office files, Howard said. Augustus gave it to me years ago, told me to give it to you when things got hard, when you needed to remember why this matters." She hugged the journal to her chest. "Thank you." And the work continued, item by item, return by return. Each one documented, each one celebrated. A year after the press conference, they'd returned 147 pieces. The collection was down to roughly 130 million in remaining items. Susan's team had grown. They'd established a proper foundation, the Whitmore Augustus Recovery Foundation. Its sole purpose was to complete the work Augustus had started. Margaret and Robert moved permanently into the mansion. They converted the West Wing into offices for the foundation. The dining room became a conference center. The sitting room hosted survivors and descendants who came to see items before they were returned. The house transformed from a vault into a place of healing. Margaret would never forget the day a 93-year-old man arrived from Argentina. He'd seen a news article about a menorah that Augustus had recovered. He claimed it was his family's. Susan's team had already authenticated his claim. DNA evidence connected him to the family. Documentation proved the menorah had been stolen from his childhood home in Krakow in 1939. The man's name was Samuel. He arrived in a wheelchair, accompanied by his daughter and grandson. Margaret led them to the climate-controlled room where the menorah was kept. It was silver, tarnished with age, but intact. Samuel began to weep before he even touched it. "My grandfather lit this every Hanukkah," he said, his voice trembling. "I was 5 years old the last time I saw it. The Nazis came the next day. I never saw my grandparents again, never saw my home again." He reached out with shaking hands and touched the menorah. "I thought everything was lost, my family, my history, everything." His daughter, herself in her 60s, put her arm around him. "Now you have this, Papa. One piece came home." Margaret couldn't watch without crying. Robert stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Samuel's grandson, a young man in his 30s, approached Margaret afterward. "My whole life, my grandfather has talked about what was stolen, what was lost. I grew up thinking it was just stories, you know? Old man memories. But seeing him touch that menorah, seeing his face..." The young man's voice broke. "You gave him back a piece of his soul. How do we thank you for that?" "You don't thank me," Margaret said gently. "You remember. You tell the story. You make sure what happened is never forgotten." The young man nodded, wiping his eyes. "We will, I promise." This was why Augustus had sacrificed everything. This was why they'd chosen to finish his work. But the work took its toll on Margaret and Robert too. The stress, the constant vigilance, the emotional weight of each return. Robert's arthritis worsened. Margaret developed high blood pressure. They were aging faster than they should have been. One night, after a particularly difficult day dealing with a disputed claim, Margaret broke down completely. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she sobbed. "Every day there's a new problem, a new claim, a new legal battle. I'm 73 years old. I'm tired, Robert. I'm so tired." Robert held her, his own eyes wet. "We can stop. We can hand it over to the foundation, to Susan's team. We've done enough." "But it's not finished. There's still so much left to return." "And it will be returned, but maybe not by us. Maybe we've done our part." Margaret pulled back, looking at him. "Augustus did this alone for 50 years. We've barely managed 5. "Augustus was alone. We have each other, but that doesn't mean we have to break ourselves." Robert cupped her face gently. "We've proven what needed to be proven. We've established the foundation. We've created the systems. The work will continue with or without us actively managing every detail." She knew he was right. The next day, she and Susan had a long conversation about transitioning leadership of the foundation. Susan would take over day-to-day operations. Margaret and Robert would remain as advisors, but the crushing responsibility would shift. It felt like both failure and relief. "You're not failing. Susan said firmly. "You're exactly what Augustus needed. You got this started. You made it public. You legitimized the work. Now let the next generation finish it." 2 years after the inheritance, the foundation had returned 223 items worth approximately $100 million. They'd reunited families with heirlooms. They'd returned masterpieces to museums. They'd given back pieces of history to communities that had been shattered. The remaining collection, valued at approximately $190 million, was still being processed. Some items had no clear owners, some were disputed, some would take decades to resolve. But Margaret wasn't worried. They'd established the foundation with enough funding to continue the work long after she and Robert were gone. They'd trained a team. They'd created protocols. Augustus's mission would continue. The financial rewards came, but not from selling art. Governments offered finder's fees for recovered items. Insurance companies paid rewards. Legitimate museums contributed to the foundation in gratitude. Margaret and Robert accepted only what was necessary to continue the work and cover their basic needs. The rest went back into the foundation. Their children tried one more reconciliation, showing up on a Sunday morning with apologies and tears. Sarah claimed she'd been wrong. David said he'd learned his lesson. Jennifer begged for forgiveness. Margaret listened to it all, then spoke quietly. "You disowned us when we had nothing, when we were just your aging parents trying to maintain our dignity and independence. You called us incompetent. You sued us. You tried to take control of our lives. Now that there's money involved, now that there's prestige and media attention, you want back in." "We made mistakes," Sarah said, "but we're still your children." "Yes, you are. And I still love you. But love doesn't mean trust. And trust, once broken the way you broke it, can't be easily repaired." "So what are you saying?" David asked. Margaret chose her words carefully. "I'm saying that you're welcome to be part of our lives if you want a genuine relationship. Sunday dinners, phone calls, grandchildren visiting. But you will have no part in the foundation, no access to the collection, no involvement in decisions about the estate. That ship sailed when you abandoned us." "That's not fair," Jennifer protested. "Life rarely is," Robert said. "But it's our decision to make." The children left angry, but this time Margaret didn't cry. She felt at peace with her choice. Though something unexpected happened 3 months later. Jennifer returned alone. No lawyer, no agenda visible on her face. Just her youngest daughter, standing on the porch with tears in her eyes. "I'm not here about the money," she said when Margaret opened the door. "I'm here because I miss my mum." They sat in the garden, the same garden where Margaret had once cried after being disowned. Jennifer twisted her hands in her lap, struggling with words. "I've been in therapy," she said finally, "working through why I reacted the way I did, why Sarah and David and I all did." She looked up. "We were scared, Mum. Scared of losing you, scared of you dying, scared of being alone. And instead of dealing with that fear, we tried to control you. We told ourselves we were protecting you, but really we were protecting ourselves from having to face that you won't be here forever." Margaret listened, her heart aching. "I'm not asking to be involved in the foundation," Jennifer continued. "I'm not asking for forgiveness I haven't earned. I just want my mom back. I want my kids to know their grandmother. I want Sunday dinners and phone calls and normal family stuff, if you'll let me." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across and took Jennifer's hand. "It won't be easy," she said. "Rebuilding trust takes time." "I know. And if you ever try to manipulate us or go back to treating us like we're incompetent, I won't, I promise." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we can try, one Sunday dinner at a time." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Sarah and David remained distant, angry, convinced they were owed something. But Jennifer kept her word. She came to Sunday dinners. She brought her children. Slowly, carefully, She rebuilt a relationship with her mother based on respect rather than expectation. It was more than Margaret had hoped for. 5 years after inheriting the mansion, Margaret stood in what had once been the master bedroom and looked out over the forest. She was 77 now. Robert was 79. They'd both slowed down, moved more carefully, needed more rest, but they'd accomplished something extraordinary. The foundation had returned 312 items worth over $150 million. They'd reunited 87 families with lost heirlooms. They'd funded educational programs about art restitution. They'd become a global model for how to handle recovered cultural property. The remaining collection would take another decade to fully process, but the systems were in place. The foundation was sustainable. Augustus's work would continue. Margaret heard footsteps and turned to see Robert in the doorway. "Thinking about him?" Robert asked. She knew he meant Augustus. Always, wondering if he'd be proud. "He chose well," Robert said. "You proved that." They'd grown stronger through all of it. Their marriage, always solid, had become unshakable. They'd faced threats together. They'd made impossible decisions together. They'd built something meaningful together. And they'd learned something Augustus had known, that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's purpose. The foundation hosted an anniversary event. Survivors attended. Descendants of original owners came. Museum directors gave speeches. The governor of the state declared it Augustus Whitmore Day. Margaret gave a short speech. She talked about the man who'd spent 50 years protecting beauty when the world wanted to profit from pain. She talked about the responsibility of inheritance, about choosing justice over wealth, but mostly she talked about how being disowned by her children had led to being chosen for something greater. "My children thought they were punishing us," she said. "They thought cutting us off would force us to surrender. Instead, it freed us. It showed us that family isn't just blood. It's choosing each other. It's standing together. And sometimes the people who abandon you give you exactly the gift you need, the freedom to become who you were always meant to be." The audience rose to their feet. The applause lasted several minutes. Afterward, Margaret and Robert stood on the mansion's front steps, watching the sunset paint the forest gold and orange. "Do you ever regret it?" Robert asked, "choosing this over a quiet retirement?" Margaret thought about it. Thought about the threats and the lawsuits and the sleepless nights. Thought about her children's betrayal and the loneliness of being cut off from family. Then she thought about Samuel touching his grandfather's menorah. About the sisters in Tel Aviv seeing their grandmother's painting. About Ernest Goldman finding peace in letting go. About the hundreds of items returned to their rightful places. About Augustus's mission completed. "Not for a second," she said. Robert kissed her forehead. "Good. Neither do I." They stood there as darkness fell, two people who'd been told they were too old, too incompetent, too stubborn. Two people who'd proven that age is just a number and that integrity matters more than inheritance. Somewhere inside the mansion, in climate-controlled rooms, the remaining collection waited patiently. It would find its way home eventually, guided by the foundation they'd built, the team they'd trained, the mission they'd embraced. Augustus Whitmore had spent 50 years carrying a burden alone. Margaret and Robert had spent 5 years proving that burden could be shared, that justice delayed could still be justice delivered, that one person's secret could become the world's redemption. And in doing so, they'd found not just purpose, but peace. Margaret looked up at the mansion, lights glowing warm against the night sky. Once it had been a tomb for buried secrets. Now it was a beacon of hope. They'd taken an inheritance nobody wanted and turned it into $290 million in returned justice. They'd taken abandonment and transformed it into legacy. But the real treasure wasn't in the vaults. It was in knowing that when they'd been given a choice between easy money and hard morality, they'd chosen right, every single time. because anyone can inherit money. But inheriting purpose, accepting responsibility, choosing justice over comfort, that's the kind of wealth that changes not just your life, but the world. As winter approached again, the frost forming delicate patterns on the mansion's tall windows, Margaret and Robert sat by the fire in the library. The same library where they'd first read Augustus's journals. The same room where they'd discovered the weight of what they'd inherited. But they weren't the same people anymore. They'd been forged in fire. They'd been tested, and they'd endured. They'd been disowned before winter, and had inherited not just a mansion, but a mission. And they'd proven that sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up giving you exactly the freedom you need to rise. Because for Margaret and Robert Chen, being cut off from their children didn't break them. It freed them to become guardians of something far greater than family money or comfortable retirement. They became keepers of justice, protectors of memory, finishers of a 50-year mission that had waited for exactly the right people to complete it. And in the basement vault that once held $290 million in secrets, now held something even more valuable, proof that doing the right thing, no matter how hard, is always worth it. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe integrity is the inheritance that matters most.